Cale Miller was mending a fishing net in his crumbling shack by the Whisperwood. The dampness of poverty had seeped into the very timbers of the place, a permanent resident like the mold in the corners. He knew the rules of his miserable life. Rule 1. Keep your head down. The world didn't reward heroes, especially poor ones. Rule 2. Never miss a payment to Lord Peaton. The ledger was a god, and that god was cruel. And especially Rule 3. Orcs were monsters, an ancient, uncrossable line. But when he found the orc female, her massive green form impossibly wedged between the grasping arms of a split ironwood tree, dying, he broke the most important rule of all, and that choice changed everything. The day had started the same as all the others, with a gnawing ache in his belly and the taste of stale air. Kyle's shack was more of a suggestion of a house than a proper home. The roof, a patchwork of rotting thatch and hope, leaked in 3 different places when it rained and 4 when it stormed. His larder was a hollow, echoing box. All he had was a half-loaf of hard bread and a few withered carrots pulled from his meagre garden patch. The debt his father left him clung to his name like a shroud, a debt to Lord Peaton, the man who owned every soul in the village of Oakhaven, whether they knew it or not. Kyle's hands, thin and calloused, worked the netting shuttle with an automatic rhythm. It was a muscle memory born of desperation. A good catch in the river meant he might have enough to trade for flour. A bad catch meant another night, listening to his stomach argue with his spine. He was a slight man, with a frame that seemed too small for the weary weight he carried in his shoulders. His hair was the color of dust, and his eyes, a washed-out blue, held a kindness that the world had tried and failed to extinguish. Hanging from a nail by the door was his only true possession, a single, rusty iron key. It was worthless. It fit no lock he had ever known, but it was his mother's. She had given it to him before the sickness took her, whispering of a home with a red door and a garden full of sunlight. It was a key to a memory, a key to a dream he no longer dared to have. It was his anchor in the relentless tide of poverty. That afternoon, the ache in his stomach drove him into the Whisperwood. The villagers avoided the forest. They said it was haunted, filled with spirits and things far worse. But Carl knew its secrets. He knew where the bittercress grew and which mushrooms wouldn't kill you. He moved through the ancient trees, their branches heavy with moss, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The silence here wasn't empty, it was watchful. He was searching for snare roots near the game trails when he heard it. Not a roar, not a cry. A low, guttural sound of pure, exhausted pain. It was a sound that vibrated deep in his bones. He froze, every instinct screaming at him to run. That was not the sound of a deer or a boar. It was something big, something dangerous. Curiosity, or perhaps his fatal inability to ignore suffering, won out over fear. He crept forward, his worn leather boots making no sound on the mossy ground. He pushed aside a curtain of hanging vines and saw her, an orc. The sight stole the air from his lungs. She was immense, a creature of corded muscle and green skin, easily twice his height if she were standing. But she wasn't standing. She was trapped. A massive, ancient ironwood tree, a victim of a recent lightning strike, had split down the middle. In its violent fissure, she was caught fast, her left leg and hip pinned by the crushing weight of the living wood. Her armor, plates of dark hammered metal, was dented and scored. A wicked-looking axe lay just out of her reach. Her face, a landscape of harsh angles and prominent tusks, was contorted in a mask of agony. Her breathing was a ragged, painful rasp. Her skin, normally a deep forest green, had a sickly, pale sheen. Kyle could see the dark stain of blood soaking the furs around her waist and down her trapped leg. She was dying, slowly, horribly. Rule 3 screamed in his mind. Orcs are monsters. Stories told around the fire were of their brutality, their bloodlust. They were the enemies of humankind. The reason the king's patrols rode the borders. To help her was treason. To be found near her was a death sentence. He should have turned. He should have walked away, back to his leaky shack and his empty larder. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But then her eyes opened. They were not the soulless red pits of the stories. They were the color of amber, and in their depths, he saw not monstrous rage, but a desperate, cornered intelligence, and something else, fear. The same fear he felt when Lord Peaton's collectors came knocking. The fear of a being with no options left. And that's when he saw the other reason for her fear. Huddled behind a fold of her cloak, small and trembling, was a child. An orc child. No more than a toddler, with wide, terrified amber eyes and skin the color of a new spring leaf. The little one clutched a crudely carved wooden wolf, his knuckles white. The mother's gaze flickered from Carl to her son, a silent, desperate plea. Not for me. For him. Carl's heart, a thing he thought had been hardened by years of neglect and hunger, broke. He saw not a monster, but a mother. He saw not an enemy, but another outcast, trapped by a world that had no place for her. The rules, the fear, the prejudice, it all crumbled into dust. He took a hesitant step forward. The orc female growled, a low, warning rumble in her chest. She tried to shift, to shield her son, but a fresh wave of pain made her gasp, her head falling back against the bark. I want to help, Carl said, his voice barely a whisper. He held up his empty hands, showing he was no threat. Her amber eyes narrowed, studying him with an ancient, weary suspicion. She had seen the cruelty of men. She expected a trick, a final mocking torment before the end. Kyle looked at the tree. The ironwood was dense, its grip absolute. He was not a strong man. His small wood axe was back at the shack, and even that would be like a penknife against this giant. He looked at her trapped leg. It was already swelling, the bone likely shattered. She wouldn't last until nightfall. The tree, he said, thinking aloud. It's already split. If I can widen the gap. He looked around, his gaze landing on a fallen branch, thick as his thigh, and another, smaller one that was wedge-shaped. An idea, desperate and foolish, sparked in his mind. He ignored her suspicious glare and went to work. He dragged the larger branch over, his muscles straining. He jammed the wedge-shaped piece into the top of the crack, high above her. Then he took the larger branch, braced his feet, and used it as a lever. He pushed. Nothing. The ironwood didn't budge. It mocked his weakness. He took a deep breath, the smell of her blood and his own sweat filling his lungs. He thought of the little one, hiding and trembling. He thought of his own mother, her hand pressing the rusty key into his, a promise of safety he could never claim. He pushed again, every ounce of his meager strength, every scrap of his desperate will, pouring into the effort. A groan went through him, a sound of pure exertion. The wood creaked, a pained, screeching sound that echoed through the silent forest. The crack widened, a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. The orc mother saw it, a flicker of disbelief, then a spark of something else crossed her face. She gathered herself, her massive muscles tensing. Now, Carl grunted, his vision starting to swim with black spots. Push! With a roar that was part pain and part raw power, she heaved her body backward. Carl put his last reserve of strength into the lever. The wood screamed, and then, with a sickening tearing sound, she was free. She collapsed onto the moss, her freed leg a mangled ruin. She lay there panting, her chest heaving. The little one scrambled to her side, whimpering. Kyle let the branch fall, his own body trembling, his arms feeling like limp ropes. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. The orc mother slowly, painfully, pushed herself into a sitting position, her back against the tree that had nearly been her tomb. She looked at her leg, Then at Kyle. The suspicion was still there, but it was now mixed with a profound confusion. "Why?" she rasped, her voice like stones grinding together. Kyle didn't have an answer, not a logical one. He just shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow with a shaky hand. "You have a child." Her gaze softened almost imperceptibly. She looked down at her son, who was now peeking at Kyle from behind the safety of her arm. She reached out and pulled her discarded axe closer, but not in a threatening way. It was a gesture of reclaiming a part of herself. "I am Gaza," she said. It wasn't an introduction. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that she still existed. "Kyle," he replied, his own name sounding small and insignificant next to hers. He looked at her leg. It was bad. The bone was clearly broken and the wound was deep and dirty. Without help, the infection would kill her just as surely as the tree would have. His shack was nearby, his leaky, crumbling, empty shack. Offering shelter was an even greater risk than freeing her. It meant bringing the monster home. He looked at the little orc, Zog, as he now thought of him. He looked at Gaza's exhausted, pain-filled eyes. He thought of the rules. Keep your head down. Never help an orc. He thought of his mother's rusty key, a key to a home he never had. Maybe a home wasn't a place with 4 walls and a solid roof. Maybe it was a choice, a single, stupid, compassionate choice. "You can't stay here," Kyle said, his voice finding a sliver of strength. You can come with me. My home is not far, it's not much, but it's dry." He left out the part about the 3, sometimes 4, leaks. Gaza stared at him, her amber eyes searching his face for the trick, the trap. She saw none. She saw only a foolish, weary-looking human man offering the impossible. She saw kindness, a weapon she hadn't faced in a very, very long time. "Why?" she asked again, the word softer this time. "Because no one should have to die alone in the woods," he said simply. He took the half loaf of hard bread from his satchel. He broke it in 2. He held out the larger piece to her. She looked at the bread. She looked at her son, whose eyes were wide and fixed on the food. Her honor warred with her desperation. Orcs did not take charity. But her son was starving. Slowly, her large 3-fingered hand reached out and took the bread. She immediately broke off a piece and gave it to the child, who devoured it in seconds. She then looked at Carl and tore a small piece from her own portion, holding it out to him. An offering, a repayment, a bond. Carl accepted it. As he chewed the dry, tasteless bread, he met her gaze. In that moment, sharing a meager meal under the shadow of the ancient trees, they were no longer human and orc. They were just 2 outcasts, clinging to a fragile thread of hope in a world that wanted them broken. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Carl's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. Getting Gaza back to the shack was an ordeal. She was a warrior, proud and impossibly strong, but her leg was a useless, agonizing weight. She refused to let Kyle carry her. The very idea was an insult to her pride, and a physical impossibility for him anyway. Instead, he found a sturdy, fallen limb to serve as a crutch. Every step was a fresh torment for her, a low grunt of pain forced through her clenched teeth. Zog, the little one, trotted silently beside his mother, his small hand clutching the fur of her leggings, his wide eyes darting fearfully at every shadow. Kyle led them on a winding, circuitous route, avoiding the main paths and staying deep within the cover of the trees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows that turned the familiar woods into a place of menace. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. What had he done? He was harboring an enemy of the kingdom. If anyone saw them, he pushed the thought away. He could only focus on the next step, and the one after that. When his shack finally came into view, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, he felt a pang of shame. Seeing it through their eyes, it looked even more pathetic than usual. A heap of rotting wood and failing thatch, a testament to his poverty. "This is it," he said, his voice apologetic. Gaza said nothing. She simply leaned heavily on her crutch, her gaze sweeping over the small clearing, the untended garden, the leaky water barrel. Her expression was unreadable. To her, who had likely lived in vast windswept plains or stone fortresses, this must have seemed like a hovel for insects. But it was shelter. It was safety. For now. He pushed open the creaking door and ushered them inside. The single room was dim, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. A low fire smoldered in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the bare walls. There was a simple straw mattress in one corner, his bed, and a rough-hewn table with one stool. It was the portrait of a lonely, impoverished life. Gaza maneuvered her bulk through the doorway and sank onto the floor by the fire with a shuddering sigh of relief. The warmth seemed to drain some of the tension from her massive shoulders. Zog immediately hid behind her, peeking out at Kyle with a mixture of fear and fascination. "I need to look at your leg," Kyle said, his voice gentle but firm. "The wound needs cleaning." She gave a short, sharp nod. The pain was now a constant, grinding force, and her warrior's pride was finally starting to yield to grim necessity. Kyle put a pot of water on the fire to boil, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency. He tore strips from one of his 2 spare shirts, creating clean bandages. He gathered the last of his healing herbs, yarrow and comfrey, from a small pouch hanging by the hearth. Kneeling before her was a surreal experience. The sheer scale of her was intimidating. Her knee was level with his chest. He carefully cut away the torn leather and fur around the wound. The sight was worse than he had feared. The ironwood had not just broken the bone, it had gouged a deep, ragged canyon in her flesh. The wound was full of dirt and splinters of wood. "This will hurt," he said softly. "I have felt worse," she grunted, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the floor. He worked for the next hour in intense, focused silence. He cleaned the wound with hot water and herbs, his touch surprisingly deft. He pulled out splinters with his fishing tweezers, each one making her flinch. Zog watched the entire process, his little face a mask of worry, his toy wolf crushed in his fist. When Kyle began to bind the leg with the clean strips of cloth, splinting it with 2 pieces of firewood, Gaza finally spoke. "You have a healer's touch," she said, the words grudging, as if pulled from her against her will. "My mother was a midwife," Kyle replied, tying the last knot. "She taught me a few things." He didn't add that most of what he'd learned had been practiced on himself after beatings from Lord Peaton's thugs for late payments. With the work done, an awkward silence fell over the small room. The reality of their situation began to sink in. A human, an orc, and an orc child, huddled together in a tiny shack, fugitives from a world that would kill them all for being in the same room. The fire crackled, a lonely sound. The ache in Kyle's stomach returned with a vengeance. He looked at his meager supplies, a few carrots, the other half of the bread. Not enough for 1 person, let alone 3. He put the carrots in the pot with some water, creating a thin, watery soup. He divided it into 3 bowls. He gave the largest portion to Gaza, a slightly smaller one to Zog, and kept the smallest for himself. Gaza looked at the steaming bowl, then at Kyle's portion. She pushed her bowl back toward him. "The child, I will not take your food. You need to heal," Kyle insisted. "You need your strength. Eat." They stared at each other across the flickering firelight, a battle of wills. Her, a proud warrior bound by the honor of her people. Him, a poor man bound by a compassion he couldn't explain. "We share," she said finally, her voice resolute. She took her bowl, poured half of its contents into his, and then pushed it firmly back into his hands. It was not a request. Honor demands it. Kyle, humbled, accepted. They ate in silence, the thin soup warming their empty bellies. Zog, seeing his mother eat, finally relaxed enough to sip his own soup, his wide eyes never leaving Kyle. After he finished, he surprised them both by pushing his empty wooden bowl toward Kyle. A silent thank you. That night, Kyle gave Garza and Zog his straw mattress. He insisted. She argued, but the exhaustion and pain were too great. She finally relented, settling her wounded body onto the meager bedding with her son curled up against her chest. Kyle tried to sleep on the hard-packed earth floor by the door, a thin blanket his only comfort. But sleep wouldn't come. He lay awake, listening to the sound of Garza's deep, rhythmic breathing and the occasional soft snuffle from Zog. The weight of his choice was a physical presence in the room. He had invited the storm into his home. Every creak of the shack, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of fear through him. He was no longer just a poor man in debt. He was a traitor, a harborer of monsters. The next few days fell into a strange, tense routine. A domestic struggle played out in whispers and gestures. Garza, immobilized by her injury, was a coiled spring of frustrated energy. She was a warrior, a hunter, a provider. To be helpless was a torment worse than any physical pain. She would watch Kyle as he went about his chores, her amber eyes critical. "Your roof is weak," she grunted one morning, pointing a thick finger at the ceiling where daylight peeked through. "A strong wind will take it." "I know," Kale said, mending his net. "I don't have the coin for new thatch." "Coin," she scoffed, the word a curse. "You humans are slaves to these little metal circles. A roof needs strong timbers and tight weaving, not coin." She tried to help in her own way. From her seated position by the fire, she used Kyle's small knife to sharpen stakes for his garden with terrifying precision. She showed him how to read the clouds, predicting the rain with an accuracy that unnerved him. She taught him 3 orc words: Aka, for water, Grom, for bread, and Lok Narash, which he translated as stay safe. Zog, in the way of children, began to thaw first. He would watch Kyle for hours, his head cocked. One afternoon, Kyle was carving a small piece of wood, trying to fashion a new handle for a tool. He fumbled, the knife slipping. Zog let out a tiny high-pitched laugh. It was the first sound Kyle had heard from him, besides whimpers. Kyle looked up, surprised. He smiled at the little orc. Then, on an impulse, he took a scrap of wood and, in a few minutes, carved a crude, blocky-looking bird. He held it out to Zog. The child stared at the offering, then looked to his mother. Garza watched them, her expression unreadable. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Zog timidly reached out his small 3-fingered hand and took the bird. He examined it closely, then looked at Kyle and gave him a wide, tusked smile. It transformed his face, chasing away the fear. A fragile trust, like a tiny seed, began to sprout in the packed earth floor of the shack. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. Their food ran out. Kyle's hunger was a familiar companion, but now he felt the hunger of 2 others. He had to go into the village. He had to trade his mended nets for flour and salt. The thought filled him with a cold dread. "I must go to Oakhaven," he told Garza, his voice low. "I will be back by midday." "They will know," she said. "It wasn't a question. They will smell your fear. They will see the lie in your eyes." "I have to," he said simply. He pulled his thin cloak tighter around his shoulders. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. He looked back at her, a giant of a creature who had brought terrifying danger into his life, and at her son, who was now clutching a wooden bird. They looked like family, a strange, broken, impossible family. "Lok Narash," he whispered. Garza's eyes widened slightly. Loch-Narash, she replied, her voice a low rumble. The village of Oakhaven was a place of narrow, suspicious streets. The prejudice here was a wall, thick and ancient, built of fear and ignorance. As Carl walked toward the market, he felt the familiar stares. He was the village outcast, the son of a debtor, the man who lived in the haunted woods. But today, the stares felt different, sharper. He felt like a walking crime. He traded his nets to the baker for a small sack of flour and a heel of bread. The baker, a large man named Elric, narrowed his eyes. "Fishing been good, Miller?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Buying more than usual." "Just stocking up," Carl lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Winter's coming." "Is it?" Elric grunted, unconvinced. Carl's escape was cut short by a voice that dripped with oily authority. "Miller, just the man I wanted to see." Carl froze. He turned to see Howell Critch, Lord Peaton's chief steward and debt collector. Critch was a thin, weasel-faced man who smelled of sour wine and ink. He held a large leather-bound ledger, the Book of Oakhaven's Misery. "Master Critch," Kyle said, his voice tight. "Lord Peaton was reviewing the accounts," Critch said, tapping a long, grimy finger on the open ledger. "Your father's debt, it is substantial, and you are 3 payments behind. His lordship is a patient man, but his patience has its limits." I had a poor catch this month," Cale stammered. "Excuses," Critch sneered, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Lord Peaton requires a payment, in full, for all 3 months, by week's end, or he will take the shack and the land it sits on. It is, after all, his land you squat upon." The demand was impossible, utterly impossible. It was a sum Kyle couldn't earn in a year. This wasn't a collection, it was an eviction notice. "But I have nowhere to go," Kyle whispered, the words tasting of ash. "That is not Lord Peaton's concern," Critch said with a final dismissive sniff. He made a new, sharp notation in his ledger. "The debt is recorded. The deadline is set." He snapped the book shut, the sound like a cell door slamming. Defeated, Kyle stumbled away, the sack of flour feeling impossibly heavy. The eyes of the villagers followed him, a mixture of pity and scorn. He was a broken man, a failure. He had not only failed himself, but now he had failed the 2 souls, hiding in his home. He was so lost in his misery that he didn't notice the new posters plastered on the village notice board until he was almost past it. It was the seal of the King's army that caught his eye, but it was the charcoal sketch beneath it that made his blood run cold. It was a rough but unmistakable drawing of an orc warrior, a female, with a prominent scar above her left eye. Just like Garza. The text below was stark. Wanted. For desertion and treason. Thrathrak Skull-Render, commander of the Ironfang Legion, offers a significant reward for the capture of the deserter Garza, or information leading to her whereabouts. Thrathrak Skull-Render. The name was infamous. A butcher, a warlord who valued power over honor, known for his brutality even among orcs. Kyle's world tilted on its axis. Garza wasn't just a refugee. She was a wanted fugitive, hunted by one of the most feared orcs alive. And Lord Peaton was about to make them homeless, throwing them directly into the path of her hunter. He ran. He fled the village, the whispers and stares fading behind him. He ran through the woods, his lungs burning, the poster's image burned into his mind. The danger was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name and a face. He burst into the shack, gasping for breath, his face pale with terror. Garza looked up, her hand instantly going to the axe that now lay beside her. "What is it?" "They know," he panted, dropping the flower. "Not about you. Not yet, but they're looking." He described the poster, the name Thrathrak, the bounty. Garza's face became a mask of stone, The name of her old commander extinguished the small spark of hope that had begun to grow in her. "He will not stop," she said, her voice a dead, flat monotone. "He will burn this whole forest to find me." "And that's not all," Cale said, his voice cracking. He told her about Lord Peaton, the debt, the threat of eviction. "We have until the end of the week. Then we have nothing." They were trapped, hunted from without and squeezed from within. The dampness of poverty and the shadow of death filled the small shack until it was hard to breathe. Kaza looked at her son, who was sleeping peacefully on the straw mattress, oblivious to the net closing around them. A fierce, protective fire ignited in her eyes, burning away her despair. She looked at Kyle, this small, terrified human who had shown her a kindness she thought no longer existed. "This debt," she said, her voice low and intense. "It is because of me. I brought this trouble to your door." "No," Kyle said, shaking his head. "This debt is old. It's my prison, not yours." "An orc pays their debts," she stated, her jaw set. "My leg is broken. I cannot fight. I cannot hunt. But I am not useless." Her gaze fell upon the forest outside the door. The Whisperwood. The humans fear it. "They say it's haunted," Cale agreed. "It is not haunted," she said, a strange light in her eyes. "It is ancient. It remembers. Before humans, before orcs, there was the wood, the heart of the wood." She looked at him, her gaze piercing. "There is power in this forest, Kyle. A power older than coin, older than warlords. A power that might save us." She reached out, her large hand surprisingly gentle, and placed it on his chest, directly over his heart. "Your heart is strong, not your body. Your spirit. You showed me kindness when all I knew was betrayal. The forest feels that. It responds to it." As her hand rested on his chest, a strange warmth spread through him. It started where she touched him, a gentle pulsing heat that felt like sunlight on a spring day. He looked down and saw a faint, green light emanating from her hand, seeping into his shirt, into his very skin. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with shock. The light was reflected in her own amber eyes, which now glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. What debt is this?" he stammered. "It is a heartwood bond," she whispered, her voice filled with a reverence he had never heard before. "It is very rare, a choice, a connection of spirit forged in desperation and trust. It links us. My strength, your compassion. We are connected now." The green light pulsed, and for a fleeting moment, Carl felt what she felt. He felt the grinding pain in her leg, the fierce, boundless love for her child, and the cold, hard knot of fear of the name Thrathrak. And she, in turn, felt his gnawing hunger, the crushing weight of his debt, and the deep, lonely ache for a home he'd never had, symbolized by a rusty key. The light faded, but the feeling remained. A thread, invisible but unbreakable, now tied them together. They were no longer just a human and an orc hiding in a shack. They were bonded, a family, chosen not by blood, but by a desperate act of compassion. The wall of prejudice had not just been cracked, it had been shattered by a force more ancient than hate. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below, would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Lord Peaton wasn't finished yet. The discovery of the Heartwood bond changed the air in the shack. The despair didn't vanish, but it was now held at bay by a fragile, glowing hope. It was a secret power, a shared strength that hummed just beneath their skin. Kyle could feel a faint echo of Gaza's formidable resolve inside him, a backbone of iron reinforcing his own weary spirit. Gaza, in turn, felt the persistent, gentle warmth of his compassion, a balm against the harsh edges of her warrior's soul. The bond, Gaza explained in the days that followed, her voice low and reverent, It grows stronger with trust. The forest gave us this gift. It chose you, Kyle. It saw your choice to help me not as weakness, but as the truest strength. She began to instruct him, her sickbed becoming a command post. She sent him into the Whisperwood not just for firewood, but on specific errands. Follow the stream to the Weeping Stone, she'd command. Behind it, you will find silver moss. Bring it. Or find the cluster of birch trees that grow in a circle. In the center, dig. You will find sun roots. Kyle, guided by her knowledge and a new uncanny instinct he couldn't explain, found every strange ingredient she described. The silver moss, when crushed and applied to her leg, drew out the inflammation with a cooling tingle. The sun roots, when boiled into a tea, eased her pain and seemed to knit her energy back together. Her healing accelerated at a startling rate. The deep greens returned to her skin, and the light of battle readiness began to rekindle in her eyes. The bond was healing her through him. Zog, too, seemed to sense the shift. He became bolder, his fear of Carl replaced by a quiet curiosity. He would sit by Kyle's side as he worked, handing him tools or pieces of wood. He even began to speak a few words of the common tongue he'd overheard, his Orcish accent making them sound strange and new. "More soup," he'd demand, pointing at the pot with his wooden bird. "Carl home," he'd announce happily when Carl returned from the woods. But the deadline loomed. The end of the week. Lord Peaton's threat was a shadow that their newfound magic could not dispel. They had no coin, no way to pay the impossible debt. "We must leave," Carl said one evening, the anxiety a tight knot in his stomach. "We can flee, go deeper into the woods, disappear." Garza, who was now able to stand for short periods, leaning on her crutch, shook her head. Her face was grim. "Fleeing is what Thrathrak expects. He is a hunter. The forest is his killing ground. And your Lord Peaton, men like him do not forgive debts. He would put a bounty on you too. We would be hunted by both sides. There would be no peace. Not for us, not for Zog." She looked from her son to Kyle, her gaze hard as flint. "No, we do not run. We make our stand. Here." "Stand?" Kyle asked, bewildered. "With what?" "I have a fishing knife. You have a broken leg." "We have the bond," she said, her voice dropping to a low, powerful growl. "And we have the truth. Thrathrak is a traitor to the Orc clans. He broke his oath. He sacrificed his own warriors in a foolish bid for a human fortress, all for personal glory. I did not desert. I refused to obey a dishonorable order. My testimony is a weapon, if it is heard." "And Peaton?" Cale asked, his voice full of doubt. "His ledger is his truth. He won't listen to anything else." "Then we must give him a truth he cannot ignore," Garza said, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, a power greater than his coin. Her plan was desperate, a wild gamble that relied on ancient magic and the courage of one very small human. The final day arrived like a sentence. The sky was a sheet of cold grey iron. A chill wind whispered through the trees, carrying the smell of rain and dread. Carl felt a tremor of fear in his hands that had nothing to do with the cold. They didn't have to wait long. The sound came first, the rhythmic tramp of heavy boots and the clink of armor. Not the clumsy footsteps of village guards, but the disciplined march of soldiers. Kyle peered through a crack in the shack's wall. His heart plummeted. It was Lord Peaton, his thin frame puffed up with self-importance. But he was not alone. He was flanked by a dozen of his personal guards, brutish men armed with swords and cudgels. And at the head of the group, walking beside Peaton as an equal, was an orc. He was even larger than Garza, his body a mountain of scarred muscle and black iron plate. A massive, double-headed axe was strapped to his back, its edges gleaming with a cruel light. His face was a nightmare of scars, and one of his tusks had been replaced with a shard of sharpened obsidian. This was Thrathrak's skull render, He scanned the woods with the dead eyes of a predator that knows its prey is near. "Miller," Lord Peaton's voice sliced through the air. "Your time is up. The debt is due. Come out and surrender the property, or we will take it by force." Inside the shack, Gaza pushed herself to her feet, her hand gripping her own axe. She looked at Kyle, her amber eyes burning with intensity. "Remember the plan. Do not let fear rule you. The bond is with you." Kyle's throat was dry. His every instinct screamed at him to hide, to bargain, to beg. But then he felt it, a surge of warmth from the bond, a phantom echo of Gaza's unyielding courage. He looked at Zog, who was hiding behind his mother, his little face pale with terror. This was for him, for this strange, broken family. He took a deep breath. He opened the door. Carl stepped out into the clearing, blinking in the flat grey light. He stood before them, a small, frail figure in worn clothes, looking utterly insignificant against the backdrop of armed men and the hulking orc warlord. "Lord Peaton," Carl said, his voice shaking but clear, "I cannot pay your debt in coin." Peaton let out a cruel laugh. "Of course you can't. You're your father's son, a worthless debtor. I am claiming this land, and everything on it." His eyes flickered toward the shack, greedy and possessive. Thrathrak ignored the exchange. His gaze was fixed on the shack's dark doorway. He could smell her, the scent of a fellow orc, mingled with blood and human filth. "The deserter is in there," Thrathrak growled, his voice a low earthquake. "Give her to me, little man, and I will let you keep your miserable life." This was it, the turning point. Carl's moment of choice. He could save himself, give her up, let the monsters devour each other. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he stood there, he felt the bond, a warm pulse against his heart. He felt Gaza's trust. He saw Zog's terrified face in his mind. He thought of his mother's rusty key, a symbol of a home. A home wasn't a place you ran from. It was a place you defended. He drew himself up to his full, unimpressive height. He planted his feet. He became a wall. "No," Kyle said. The word was quiet, yet it echoed in the sudden silence of the clearing. Peaton's jaw dropped. Thrathrak's eyes narrowed into slits. "What did you say, you insignificant worm?" Thrathrak snarled, taking a threatening step forward. "I said no," Kyle repeated, his voice stronger now, fueled by a righteous fire he didn't know he possessed. "The woman you seek is under my protection. And this land is not yours to take, Lord Peaton." A ripple of disbelief went through the guards. Lord Peaton's face turned a blotchy, furious red. "Insolence! Seize him, and drag the orc out of there." But before the guards could move, Gaza appeared in the doorway. She leaned on her crutch, her injured leg wrapped in Kyle's crude bandages. But she was not a figure of pity. She was magnificent. Her head was held high, her axe held ready in one hand. Her eyes were locked on Thrathrak. "Thrathrak," she boomed, her voice ringing with authority and contempt. "You have no honor. You call me deserter, but it is you who betrayed the code. You who sent the Iron Fang to their deaths for your own vanity." "Lies!" Thrathrak roared, his rage making him seem even larger. "You fled from battle, coward." "I fled from a butcher who sacrificed his own soldiers," she shot back. "I challenge your command. I demand a council of clans to hear my testimony." The confrontation was primal, a battle of orc honor that the humans could barely comprehend. But Lord Peaton had no time for such things. "Enough of this theatre," he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "This is my land. That is my debt." He pointed a trembling finger at Carl. "He owes me. His pathetic life is forfeit." This was the moment Gaza had been waiting for, the convergence of two different kinds of debt, one of honor, one of coin. "A debt must be paid," Gaza said, her voice dropping, taking on a strange, resonant quality. She looked at Kyle. "And a kindness must be repaid." She took a hobbling step forward, out of the shadow of the shack and into the center of the clearing. She raised her free hand, the one not holding her axe. Carl Miller saved my life, and the life of my son. He sheltered me. He fed me from his own empty larder. He showed me honor when my own kind showed me betrayal. This creates a debt that cannot be paid in coin. She looked at the ground, at the damp earth of the Whisperwood. This land does not belong to you, Lord Peaton. It belongs to itself, and it has judged you. She slammed the butt of her axe handle into the ground. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The heartwood bond, nurtured by trust and now unleashed by righteous anger, erupted. A wave of brilliant green light exploded from the point of impact, washing over the clearing. It wasn't a violent force, but it was overwhelming. The air grew thick, humming with an ancient, primal power. From the ground around Garza's feet, glowing green vines, thick as a man's arm, snaked out with impossible speed. They did not attack. They revealed. The vines wrapped around Thrathrak's legs, holding him fast, but they did not crush him. Instead, the green light intensified, and in the air above his head, shimmering images appeared. The bond was projecting the truth from Garza's heart for all to see. They saw the battlefield. They saw Thrathrak ordering his legion into a suicidal charge. They saw him holding back his own elite guard, saving them while the rank and file were slaughtered. They saw Garza, her face a mask of horror and fury, refusing the order. They saw the truth. He was a coward and a traitor. Simultaneously, other vines snaked toward Lord Peaton. They coiled around his precious ledger, which he dropped with a yelp. The green light pulsed, and the pages of the ledger began to flip on their own. But the numbers and names written in ink faded, replaced by glowing green script. The script showed not just Kyle's debt, but the crooked deals, the extortion, the false entries Peaton had used to enslave the entire village for generations. His entire reign of greed was laid bare, a litany of crimes against the people he was supposed to steward. Peaton's guards were frozen, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. They saw the truth of Thrathrak's dishonor. They saw the proof of Peaton's corruption. They were guards, but they were also men of Oakhaven, whose families had suffered under Peaton's thumb for years. Carl stood, untouched by the light, watching in stunned silence. He felt the power of the bond coursing through him, a roaring river of ancient justice. He, the weak, powerless outcast, was the anchor for this incredible magic. His small act of kindness had become a weapon of undeniable truth. Thrathrak roared in fury, trying to break free of the vines, but they held him as tight as the ironwood tree had held Garza. He was trapped not by wood, but by his own dishonor. Lord Peaton stared at his ledger, at the glowing green accusations, and gibbered in pure terror. His power was not in his sword arm. It was in that book, and that book had just condemned him. The light faded. The vines remained, holding the two antagonists fast. The clearing was silent, save for the whistling of the wind and Lord Peaton's pathetic whimpers. Garza stood tall, leaning on her axe now, like a scepter. She had not thrown a single punch, yet she had won an absolute victory. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a new voice spoke, old and weathered but firm. The forest has spoken. Carl turned to see Elder Maeve, the oldest resident of Oakhaven, stepping out from behind a tree. And behind her were the other villagers. The baker, Elric, the blacksmith, the farmers. They had followed Peaton's party, drawn by the commotion. They had seen everything, the magic, the truth. Elder Maeve walked slowly into the center of the clearing. She looked at the glowing vines, at the terrified Lord Peaton, and the enraged Thrathrak. Then she looked at Kyle, and for the first time in his life, he saw respect in the eyes of a fellow villager. "The debt is paid," she declared, her voice ringing with authority that dwarfed Peaton's. She looked at his guards. "This man," she said, pointing to Peton, is a thief. And this orc, she gestured to Thrathrak, is a coward without honor. They have no power here. Slowly, one by one, Peton's guards lowered their weapons. They looked at each other, then at the villagers. They laid their swords on the ground. The system had been broken. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The happy ever after began not with a grand celebration, but with quiet, determined work. Thrathrak, stripped of his authority by the public revelation of his dishonor and magically bound, was handed over to a contingent of king's soldiers who had been investigating his legion's disastrous losses. They had been searching for a deserter, but they left with a disgraced warlord. His exile from power was absolute. Lord Peton's fate was decided by the villagers of Oakhaven. Faced with the undeniable, magical proof of his crimes, his power evaporated like mist in the sun. Elder Maeve, acting as the village's voice, banished him from the lands he had bled dry for so long. He was cast out, left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the memory of his own wickedness. His ledger, its pages now blank, was ceremonially burned in the village square, the smoke rising as a symbol of their newfound freedom. The ancient debts were gone, erased by magic and courage. But the most profound change happened back at the little shack by the Whisperwood. The day after the confrontation, a crowd of villagers appeared at Kyle's clearing. He tensed, expecting more trouble, but they came not with weapons, but with tools and timber, sacks of flour and bundles of new thatch. Elric the baker, a man who had once looked at Kyle with suspicion, clapped him on the shoulder. "Your roof is weak," he said, echoing Garza's words, but his voice was full of gruff respect. "A strong wind will take it. We've come to help." For the next week, the clearing was filled with the sounds of hammers, saws, and laughter. The villagers, freed from Peton's yoke, worked together with a shared sense of purpose they hadn't felt in years. They replaced Kyle's rotting roof, reinforced his walls, and helped him plant a proper winter garden. Garza, her leg now healing properly, directed the work from a stool, her warrior's eye for structure proving invaluable. The villagers, who had once feared her as a monster, now listened to her advice with respect. They saw not a monster, but a skilled engineer, a protective mother, and an honorable ally. Zog, no longer afraid, played among the villagers' children, his wooden bird and their own simple toys mingling in the grass. The wall of prejudice had fallen, and in its place, a bridge was being built. One evening, as the new roof was being finished, Elder Maeve approached Kyle and Garza. She held a small, earth-stained wooden box. "The Heartwood Bond is an ancient pact with the land," she explained, her voice soft. "It chooses those who value life and honor above all else. It has not been seen in these parts for 500 years. She looked at Kyle. "The shack is yours now, Kyle. The land is yours. A gift from the village. A home, earned by your compassion." Then she looked at the rusty key that Kyle still wore on a leather thong around his neck. "May I see that?" Kyle, puzzled, handed it to her. She took the key and fitted it into the lock on the ancient wooden box. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not gold or jewels, but a single, dried seed and an old, rolled-up parchment. The parchment was a deed to Kyle's plot of land, signed and sealed by a king from a forgotten age, granting it to his ancestors not for service in war, but for protecting the Whisperwood. The debt that had haunted his family for generations had been a lie, built upon a stolen history. The key wasn't to a lost house, but to his rightful home, his stolen legacy. Tears welled in Kyle's eyes as he took the deed. He had a home, a real home. He looked at Garza, at Zog, at the villagers working on his roof. He had a family, a real family. The seed, Maeve explained, was from the Heartwood itself. She gave it to Kyle. "Plant it," she said. "Where there is a bond, a new Heartwood can grow." Later that night, under the light of a full moon, Kyle, Gaza, and Zog went to the center of the garden. Kyle dug a small hole in the rich earth. He placed the seed inside. Gaza, her hand resting on his shoulder, channeled a faint pulse of the bond's green energy into the ground. Zog poured a cup of water over it. Together, they buried it. The shack was no longer a symbol of poverty. It was a home, warm and sturdy. The debt was gone, replaced by a community's gratitude. The warlord was exiled, the forest was safe. A new mixed community was forming, one where orcs and humans could share a meal and children could play together without fear. A community built on a simple, powerful truth. Different doesn't mean enemy. Kale stood with Gaza, looking out at the moonlit forest. He, the weak human, had stood up for the strong orc. She, the formidable warrior, had paid his impossible debt with a truth more valuable than gold. And in doing so, they had saved each other, and an entire village besides. And that is how a poor human and a noble orc warrior proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.